He thought he'd bought a bride to end his loneliness. But when a much older woman stepped off the train, it changed everything forever. The train station sat at the edge of town, where the wide prairie met the rails, and the wind carried dust into every corner. Samuel Cole stood by the platform, his hat pulled low to shield his eyes, his boots planted firm in the dirt. He had shaved that morning, though the blade had scraped his skin raw, and he had pressed his best shirt even if the sleeves were frayed. Nearing 40, he had lived most of his life alone, the ranch his only company, cattle and wind the only voices that answered him. Today felt different. Today a train was coming with a woman on board, a woman he had promised to take as his wife. He told himself she would change his life, that maybe at last the silence at his supper table would not echo so loud. The whistle sounded, long and sharp, cutting across the heat of the afternoon. Families gathered close, children bouncing at the thought of fathers and brothers returning, merchants waiting for goods, drifters waiting for nothing at all. Samuel stood a little apart, watching the black engine roll in, its iron wheels screaming against the rails. His heart thudded harder than it had in years, not from fear of cattle stampede or storm, but from the thought of meeting eyes with the young woman who had answered the matchmaker's letter. Steam hissed, the train slowed, doors swung open. Men in suits stepped down first, tipping hats to wives who rushed forward, laughter spilling into the air. A soldier hugged his mother, a miner kissed his girl, a drummer boy lugged his case. Samuel's eyes searched every face, his rough hand tugging once at the collar of his shirt. He tried to picture her, this promised bride, younger by 10 years, maybe more, with soft skin untouched by hard winters, with a voice that might carry laughter into his hollow house. He had never been good with women, too stiff, too quiet, too weathered, and one by one in his youth they had drifted toward other men who had easy charm. But the letter from the matchmaker had spoken plain, a willing bride for a hard worker, a woman of youth ready to make a life. Samuel had paid the fee with steady hands and a guarded heart. The platform grew busy, voices rising, trunks thudding onto wood. Samuel's eyes darted left and right, but no woman stepped toward him. No soft smile or shy glance met his own. He felt the sweat gather at the back of his neck, the dust itch under his collar. He stood straighter, trying not to look lost among the bustle. He saw a girl in a bright dress run into her father's arms, saw a young wife kiss her husband, saw strangers pass by with purpose, but none looked at him. He shifted his boots, cleared his throat, his chest tight with a hope he dared not name. The last of the passengers began to file out, and Samuel's breath caught as he told himself that somewhere among them his future waited, though the ache in his ribs warned him life was never that simple. The steam from the train still clung to the air, curling around the platform like ghostly fingers as the last passengers stepped down. Samuel kept his eyes sharp, his chest tight, waiting for the girl he had been promised. He had pictured her so often on lonely nights, imagined her small gloved hands, her hopeful smile, her youth bright against the worn wood of his house. One by one the passengers were claimed, until the crowd began to thin and the noise of reunions softened into scattered laughter and footsteps. Then a woman stepped forward, and Samuel's breath caught. She was not the girl he had been waiting for. She was older, much older, her hair streaked with gray, her face lined in ways the years carve without mercy. She walked with her shoulders straight, her step firm though it carried the weight of tired miles. She stopped in front of him, her carpetbag gripped in one hand, a folded letter in the other. Her eyes met his, without flinching, sharp yet tired, like a flame that refused to go out though the wind had tried for years. Samuel's throat went dry as she held out the letter, and in that moment he realized the matchmaker had tricked him or mistaken the details. The young bride he had paid for was nowhere on that platform. This woman, nearing 50, stood in her place. "I am Miriam Hale," she said, her voice calm but worn, like a hymn sung too many times. The letter said you were Samuel Cole. Samuel took the paper slowly, his rough fingers brushing hers by accident. The letter was indeed the one he had sent months back. His own name, written clear at the bottom, the promise of marriage spelled out in plain script. But the woman before him was not what he had pictured. Not the girl he had built in his mind on long rides across his ranch. Not the bride he had imagined filling the silence of his house. Around them, the last of the families left, casting glances as they passed. Samuel could hear the low chuckles, the whispers that always traveled faster than dust in a town like this. He could feel the shame rise hot in his chest, pressing against his collar. Miriam did not flinch under the looks. She stood steady, chin lifted, as though she had endured stares far sharper than these. Samuel cleared his throat, his voice coming out rougher than he meant. "You are not who I was told to expect." Her gaze did not falter. "I imagine I am not," she said simply. No apology, no plea, only fact. He looked at her again, really looked, at the gray streaks woven through her hair, at the lines around her eyes that spoke of laughter long past and sorrow carried quietly, at the way she held herself, not as a girl waiting to be chosen, but as a woman who knew what it was to be unwanted and kept walking anyway. For a moment, Samuel wanted to turn away, to send her back on the next train, to escape the humiliation burning in his ears. But the way she gripped her carpetbag, the way her shoulders squared, as if bracing for rejection yet refusing to beg, held him still. The crowd had gone. The platform lay quiet now, only the hiss of the train fading into the distance. Miriam shifted her bag and said softly, "I came as asked. What happens now is up to you." The word struck him harder than any insult, because he knew she was right. The street outside the station was alive with the usual clatter of wagons, hooves striking against packed dirt, and voices carrying from the saloon porch. But today, the sound seemed sharper, more pointed, as though every laugh and whisper cut straight toward Samuel Cole. He walked stiff beside Miriam Hale, his broad shoulders tight under his worn shirt, his jaw set hard as stone. He could feel the eyes of the townsfolk trailing them, the mismatch plain as day. He was a man nearing 40, weathered but still strong, while she was near 50, her hair touched with gray, her face lined from years that no soft life had shielded. The townspeople needed no words to say what their eyes already shouted. A boy at the water trough nudged his friend, their snickers spilling into the open. Two women outside the mercantile leaned close, whispering behind gloved hands, their bonnets hiding nothing of their sharp stares. Samuel caught the sound of one muttered word, pity wrapped in mockery, and his ears burned hot though his face betrayed nothing. He wanted to turn, to silence them with the weight of his voice, but pride held him still. To fight meant admitting shame, and shame already pressed hard enough against his chest. Miriam walked beside him without flinching. Her carpetbag swung lightly at her side, her steps even, her chin lifted just high enough to refuse defeat. If she felt the sting of their judgment, she hid it well, as though years of carrying heavier burdens had left her immune to the small cruelties of strangers. Samuel glanced at her once, just once, and saw no trembling in her hands, no falter in her stride. She did not cling to him, did not beg his defense. She simply walked, as though she had every right to take her place on that street, even if the world laughed behind her back. At the hitching post, Samuel stopped, untying the reins of his wagon horse with slow, deliberate movements, each tug of the leather a way to keep from meeting the eyes that still lingered nearby. Miriam stood beside him, silent, waiting, not pressing him for words he did not have. He gestured toward the wagon, his voice flat, courteous but distant. "Climb in." She obeyed with the quiet strength of someone long used to doing for herself, setting her bag across her knees, her skirt falling neatly over the edge of the bench. Samuel swung up beside her, the boards creaking under his weight, and with a click of his tongue the horse started forward. Dust rose behind the wheels, carrying with it the sound of low chuckles from the men outside the saloon. Samuel's hands tightened on the reins until his knuckles whitened. He did not look back, though he felt the eyes follow him all the way down the street. Beside him, Miriam sat straight, her gaze fixed ahead, her expression unreadable. The humiliation hung heavy in the hot air, yet she refused to bend beneath it. Samuel, caught between pride and pity, between the sting of his own shame and the strange steadiness of the woman at his side, rode on in silence, already questioning what kind of future lay waiting at the end of the road. The wagon rattled over the last rise, and Samuel's ranch came into view, a low house of weathered boards and a barn standing against the open land. The place was sturdy enough, but carried no warmth. The fences leaned where the wind had pressed too long, the porch boards were gray and bare, and the windows stared out like eyes that had forgotten how to welcome anyone home. Miriam sat with her hands folded over her bag, her face unreadable as she looked at the spread that was now meant to be hers too. Samuel said nothing as he guided the horse into the yard, the quiet stretching between them until even the creak of the wagon seemed louder than words. He lifted her bag down first, setting it on the porch, then offered his hand. She took it with a firm grip, steady though her body carried the weight of years and miles. Inside, the house smelled faintly of dust and smoke, not rot, not filth, but emptiness. The walls were bare, no pictures, no tokens of memory, only boards rubbed smooth by time. A table stood in the center with two chairs, one worn to the shape of Samuel's frame, the other stiff as though it had never been sat in. The floorboards were swept but unpolished, the corners tidy but stark. It was the kind of place built for work and sleep, not for laughter, not for family. Miriam set her bag down and brushed her skirt, her eyes moving slowly across the room, not judging, just seeing. Samuel caught her glance and felt heat climb the back of his neck. He had never noticed the silence of the house before, not really, because he had lived inside it so long that it had become part of him. Now with her standing there, that silence pressed in on him, sharp as a blade. He busied himself with supper, pulling bread and beans from the stove, setting them on the table without ceremony. Miriam helped by fetching plates, though she had to search for them in bare cupboards that held little more than tin cups and a few cracked bowls. They ate without much sound, the scrape of cutlery filling the space where conversation might have lived. Samuel did not mean to be unkind, but words had never been his gift. He had grown used to silence, used to the company of cattle and the wind, not the presence of another soul across the table. He caught her eyes once, saw not anger there but patience, as though she understood the habit of quiet, even if it gnawed at her more than it did him. When the meal was finished, Samuel showed her the small room off the hall, its bed narrow but clean, its walls as bare as the rest. Miriam unpacked a shawl and a book of worn pages, setting them carefully on the table beside the bed. Later, after Samuel had banked the fire and the house had settled into night, he heard her voice soft through the wall. She prayed in words too quiet to follow, the sound drifting like lost feathers into the dark. Samuel lay awake listening, not sure why the sound of her prayer unsettled him. Not harsh, not heavy, just a reminder that he was no longer alone, and the silence he had lived in so long was no longer his alone to keep. The days moved slowly across the wide plain, the sun rising over the ridge and setting in a wash of red behind the barn. And in that stretch of hours, Miriam worked without complaint. She took to mending Samuel's shirts, stitching seams that had split long ago, her needle flashing in the firelight while the quiet of the house bent around her. She swept the floor until the boards showed their grain again, set the hearth in order, and kept a kettle warm, filling the rooms with the smell of broth instead of dust. She did not chatter as she worked, nor did she ask for praise, but the small changes gathered like drops in a bucket, and Samuel found himself noticing even as he tried not to. He moved about the ranch as he always had, checking the cattle, fixing the fence line, hauling water from the well. Yet he felt her presence even when she was not in sight, the way the house no longer echoed hollow when he returned, the way his shirts hung straighter on the peg after she washed and pressed them. He avoided her eyes at supper, speaking only when duty required, but he could not ignore the steadiness in her hands when she set the bread on the table, nor the patience in her steps when she crossed the room. Shame pressed on him harder than the sun on his back. He had sent money for a young bride, a girl who would give him sons and soften the edges of his rough life, and instead he had been given a woman near 50, a woman who carried years carved into her face like lines in a map. He pictured the neighbors, their laughter sharp, their whispers quick, calling him desperate, saying Samuel Cole could not win a wife by any honest charm, and had to settle for whatever the matchmaker had tossed his way. He remembered the saloon porch, the muttered jokes, the women with their bonnets tilted just enough to hide their smirks, and the thought bit deep. Still, in the quiet moments when his pride loosened its grip, he recalled the women of his younger years, the ones who had smiled at him in town but drifted off with men who spoke smoother and laughed easier. They had been pretty, bright as sparrows, but quick to fly. Miriam was nothing like them. She did not flutter or pretend. She moved with calm strength, as though she had long ago decided not to waste herself on vanity or show. Watching her thread a needle by lamplight, her brow furrowed in quiet focus, Samuel felt something twist in his chest that was not shame but something harder to name. At night, when the house grew still, and he lay on his bed staring at the ceiling, he thought of her voice at prayer, steady and low, and the memory followed him into sleep. He told himself he did not want her, that she was not what he had bargained for, but each day, her presence settled deeper into the cracks of his life, like roots working into dry earth, patient and unshaken by the wind. The morning sun lay hot across the yard, dust swirling where the cattle had passed through, and Samuel stood with his hired hand by the corral, mending a rail that had split in the last storm. The boy's name was Tom, no more than 20, strong in the arms but careless in the tongue, the kind who carried a smirk even when silence would have served him better. Miriam came from the house with a basket of bread she had baked at dawn, her steps steady, her shawl drawn across her shoulders, though the day was already warm. She walked as if she belonged there, as if the house and yard had already shaped themselves around her, though Samuel knew the talk in town still echoed against them. Tom leaned on the fence rail, watching her approach with that grin young men wear when they think cruelty is clever. "Your ma brought us bread," he said loud enough for Samuel to hear, his voice sharp with mockery. "Kind of you, ma, looking after us boys." The word struck Samuel like a spur to the ribs. His jaw tightened, yet the words to rebuke the boy caught in his throat. He felt the heat rise in his face, shame burning hotter than the sun, because the insult was not only at Miriam, but at himself too, at the mismatch that the whole town had already laughed about. For a moment he stood silent, hands gripping the rail, the choice to speak or not gnawing at him. Miriam's eyes flicked to him, waiting, and in that heartbeat, his silence must have felt like betrayal. But Miriam did not falter. She lifted her chin, her voice calm and steady, not sharp, not wounded. "I am not your ma, son," she said, her words carrying both dignity and a faint edge of kindness, as though she were correcting a child rather than answering an insult. "But I thank you for treating the bread as a gift, even if you forget your manners." She set the basket on the rail, her hands firm, and turned to Samuel with the faintest nod before walking back toward the house, her back straight, her steps unhurried. Samuel felt something twist inside him then, a knot of guilt and something harder to name. He had stood mute when he should have spoken, had let her defend herself in front of a boy who had no right to put her low. Yet he had also seen the steadiness in her, the way she met cruelty without flinching, the way her dignity stood taller than mockery. His throat ached with words he had failed to say, and for the first time he wondered if his silence had been less about shame and more about fear of admitting that this woman, whom others scorned, had shown more strength than he had. When Tom muttered another laugh, Samuel turned on him at last, his voice rough as gravel. "You'll keep a civil tongue in this yard. She is mistress of this house, and you'll remember it." The boy's smirk faltered, and he bent back to the rail, muttering no more. Samuel stood a long while after Miriam had gone inside, the taste of guilt still heavy, but beneath it a reluctant admiration growing, sharper than pride, that this woman who bore the weight of whispers carried herself with more grace than he had ever expected. The storm rolled in fast from the west, the sky blackening with heavy clouds that swallowed the sun and pressed low over the plain. Samuel had seen storms before, but this one carried a force that made the cattle restless and the horses paw at the ground. By the time the first crack of thunder split the air, wind was already lashing across the yard, pulling at the shutters and rattling the loose boards on the porch. Rain came in a sheet, drumming the roof so hard it sounded like gunfire. Samuel moved quickly to secure the barn doors, water running down his back as he fought against the wind, his hat nearly torn from his head. Inside the house, Miriam worked without panic, pulling cloths to block the draft, setting the kettle away from the flames, moving with the calm of someone who had weathered storms before. When Samuel rushed in, shaking rain from his shoulders, he heard the roof groan under the weight of the wind. A shingle snapped free and clattered to the ground outside, then another, until he knew the roof would tear if it wasn't held fast. He turned to grab his tools, but Miriam was already at the door with hammer in hand, her shawl tied tight around her shoulders. "You're not climbing up there," he barked, his voice rougher than he meant, but she only met his eyes with a steady gaze. "It won't hold unless someone does, and you cannot do it alone," she answered. Before he could stop her, she stepped into the rain, skirts whipping around her legs, determination carrying her forward. Samuel cursed under his breath and followed. She had already found the ladder leaning against the side of the house, and with surprising strength she began to climb. The hammer gripped firm. He shouted for her to come down, but the wind carried his words away. She reached the roof, rain soaking her hair, her dress clinging close, and began pounding the nails with quick strikes, fighting the storm with each blow. When she slipped on the slick boards, Samuel's heart jolted. He was on the ladder in an instant, reaching her just as her foot slid. His hands caught her around the waist, pulling her against him, steadying her before the fall could take her. For a moment the storm seemed to pause, his hands warm against her, her breath quick, her eyes fierce as they met his. Neither spoke. The hammer slipped from her fingers and landed with a dull thud on the wet roof, but neither moved to pick it up. The wind howled again, breaking the spell, and Samuel guided her carefully down the ladder, his grip never faltering. On the ground she pulled free, her chin lifting in defiance, even as water streamed down her face. "I could have managed," she said, though her voice trembled with more than the cold. He shook his head, his voice softer now. "You shouldn't have to." They gathered the tools and waited out the storm from the porch, the roof battered but still standing. The silence between them no longer felt sharp, but stretched like a bridge just beginning to hold. Samuel sat beside her, close enough to feel the heat of her shoulder through the damp shawl, and though no words were spoken, something unspoken shifted, narrowing the distance that had kept them apart since the day she stepped off the train. The storm had passed and left the air clean, the smell of wet earth rising from the ground, the sky washed clear by the rain. That evening the house felt softer somehow, though the roof still bore its wounds, and Samuel set supper on the table with more care than usual. Miriam joined him without a word, her hair still damp from where it had escaped the braid, her hands red from work, her eyes steady. They ate in the quiet they had grown used to, the clink of spoons in bowls, the creak of wood as they shifted in their chairs. Yet something pressed between them, not the sharp silence of strangers, but the heavier silence of people holding back truths too long. It was Miriam who broke it first. She set her spoon down and folded her hands, her voice low but clear. "I was a teacher once, in Missouri, had a room full of children, who could barely sit still, but who learned their letters all the same. I thought I would teach until my hair turned gray, but a woman's life rarely follows the path she sets out. She paused, her gaze far away, as though she still saw the little desks, the chalkboard, the faces of children grown long since. I was engaged then too. A good man, or so I believed. But years went by, and when my youth faded, so did his affection. Duty called him elsewhere, and I was left behind. I was never chosen after that. Her words carried no bitterness, only a quiet resignation worn smooth by time. Samuel listened, his chest tight, his spoon idle in his hand. He had wondered about her before, about the lines in her face, the steady patience in her work, the way she never begged for his approval. Now he saw it clearer. The weight of promises broken, the strength it took to keep walking when the world had told her she was too old to matter. He pushed his bowl aside, leaned back, and after a long moment spoke. I never married either. Fought in the war when I was young. Came back with scars that showed and some that didn't. Tried courting once or twice, but women didn't take to me. Too quiet, too rough, too much land, and too little charm. One by one they turned to men who made them laugh. I gave up after a while, told myself the ranch was all I needed. Miriam's eyes turned to him then, not with pity, but with a kind of knowing. The silence that followed was different than the silences before. It was heavy, yes, but it carried weight instead of emptiness, like soil pressed down to make roots strong. Samuel held her gaze for longer than he ever had before, and for the first time, he did not feel ashamed of the quiet that stretched between them. It was no longer the silence of loneliness, but the silence of two lives scarred in different ways, now sitting close enough for those scars to be seen. The morning broke clear and warm. The storm washed air sharp with the smell of grass and damp soil. Samuel took his tools out to the east pasture, where a stretch of fence had given way under the storm's weight. Miriam followed with a basket, carrying bread and water, her steps steady, her skirt brushing against the tall weeds. She did not ask to help, but when he began to work, she stood near, handing him nails and holding rails in place with a strength that surprised him. They worked side by side in silence, the rhythm of hammer and wood filling the open air. Near the corral, the mule brayed, its long ears twitching, its stubborn face turned away from the water trough Samuel had set out fresh. He cursed under his breath and muttered, "That mule's more trouble than all the cattle put together." Miriam shaded her eyes with her hand, watching the beast plant its hooves firm and refuse to budge. She tilted her head and said with the faintest smile, "Maybe he's only waiting for you to ask polite." The words slipped out before she thought too hard, and for a breath she feared she had overstepped, but Samuel stopped mid-swing and stared at her. Then, to her surprise, a rough laugh broke from him, awkward at first, as though unused, but real. It startled them both, the sound cutting through the stillness like sunlight breaking cloud. He leaned a hand on the rail, shaking his head, the laugh fading into a low chuckle. Miriam felt warmth rise in her chest, not from the sun but from the sight of him unguarded for once. She bent to pick up another nail, hiding her own smile, but her hands trembled slightly. Samuel cleared his throat, his voice rough. "That mule don't care for polite or harsh. He just cares for his own way." Yet the corners of his mouth still carried the ghost of that laugh, and he stole glances at her as though wondering what else she might say to draw it out again. They finished the fence before noon, the rails straight, the nails firm. As they gathered the tools, Miriam felt the silence shift between them, no longer heavy but stretched thin with something lighter. When Samuel carried the basket back to the house, she walked beside him, their steps falling in rhythm, neither speaking yet, neither wishing to break the small thread that had been tied by a single shared moment of laughter. That night, after supper, Miriam sat near the fire with her sewing, the lamplight soft against her face. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet Samuel had always known, but now it felt different. Without thinking, she began to hum, low and gentle, the tune of an old hymn half forgotten. Samuel froze where he sat, his head turning slowly toward her. The sound was not loud, not polished, but it filled the room in a way silence never could. He listened, his chest tight, as though hearing music for the first time in years. The fire crackled, the needle slipped through cloth, and her humming wrapped around the hollow places in him like balm. He said nothing, but when she looked up, she found his eyes on her, steady, almost soft, and she knew the distance between them had narrowed once again. The sun was sinking low when the sound of hooves carried across the yard, sharp and hurried, stirring the dogs into a frenzy. Samuel stepped out from the barn, wiping sweat and dust from his brow, his hammer still in his hand. 3 riders came hard from the south trail, neighbors from miles off, their horses lathered and restless. Samuel knew their faces well enough, men who owned spreads larger than his, men who always carried news with a weight behind it. They reined up by the fence, dust rising around them, voices tense. "There's been trouble," the first said, his voice clipped. "Cattle thieves working their way through the valley, bold as ever. Took a dozen head off Parker's land last night. You'd better be ready, Cole. They won't leave your herd untouched." Samuel's jaw tightened, his hand sliding over the hammer's handle before he set it aside. "I'm ready," he answered, steady but low. He had fought thieves before, and he knew the ruin they left behind. The second man, broader and louder, glanced past Samuel toward the porch, where Miriam stood in the doorway, her apron still in her hands from the kitchen. His mouth twisted into a smirk. "Seems to me you got more than cattle weighing you down these days. Hard enough keeping your herd safe without an old burden dragging at your side." His words dripped with mockery, loud enough for her to hear. Samuel felt heat rise behind his eyes. His jaw worked hard, and for a moment the urge to snap back roared in him. Miriam's face stayed calm, her back straight, but he saw the flicker of color in her cheeks, the faint tightening of her hands on the fabric she held. The third rider shifted uneasily, muttering for the loud one to hold his tongue, but the damage was done. Samuel stepped forward, his voice rough as gravel. "You worry about your own house. This is mine. She's under my roof, and that makes her worth more than your words." The smirk faltered, though the man tried to hide it with a scoff. With a kick of his spurs, he turned his horse, and the others followed, dust trailing behind as they rode back into the darkening plain. When the sound of hooves faded, silence settled heavy. Samuel stood in the yard, his shoulders rigid, his fists tight at his sides. Miriam came down the porch steps slowly, the apron still clutched in her hands. Her voice was soft, careful. "You don't have to defend me. Not to them, not to anyone. I've borne words worse than theirs." Samuel turned to her, his gaze steady, his face still hard but his eyes different now. "Maybe I do," he said, simple as stone, his voice carrying weight. For a long moment they stood in the yard, the last light spilling over them, the smell of dust and sage heavy in the air. Miriam looked at him and saw not pity, not shame, but something sharper and cleaner. Respect. And for the first time since she stepped off the train, she felt the ground beneath her feet belonged to her as much as it did to him. The night was still when it began, the kind of quiet that makes a man uneasy. Samuel had been half asleep when the dogs broke into frantic barking, their cries cutting through the darkness like blades. He was on his feet before his mind caught up, pulling on his boots, reaching for the rifle by the door. Then he smelled it, sharp and choking, the acrid bite of smoke curling through the air. His heart lurched as he threw open the door and saw the barn lit with a red glow, flames climbing fast along the dry boards, sparks snapping into the sky. Miriam was already in the yard, her shawl thrown over her nightdress, her hair loose and whipping in the wind. She held a bucket in her hands, running toward the well with a speed that belied her age. The cattle bawled from their pens, the horses kicked against the stalls, and the thieves' shadows flickered at the edges of the firelight, moving quick and silent. Samuel raised his rifle and fired, the crack echoing across the plain. One figure ducked low, and vanished into the dark. Another cursed as lead bit the ground near his boots. The rest scattered, leaving the fire to finish the ruin. Samuel sprinted toward the barn, his rifle hot in his hands, smoke burning his throat. He fired again into the night, not to kill but to drive them farther off. And then he was at the doors, tugging at the heavy latch. Heat licked at his skin, his arms straining, until the doors gave way with a groan. The animals pushed against one another in panic, eyes rolling white, hooves slamming wood. He shouted and swung the gate wide, guiding them out into the open yard, forcing them clear of the flames. Behind him, Miriam came running with water, sloshing it across the hay that had caught, soaking the sparks before they could spread. She went back and forth from the well to the barn, her breath harsh, her face streaked with smoke, refusing to stop, though her body shook with the effort. When a burning beam cracked and fell, blocking a corner of the stall, she grabbed hold and tried to shift it, coughing hard, and Samuel rushed to her side. Together they heaved, the fire spitting at their skin, until the last of the calves broke free and stumbled out into the yard. The barn sagged, flames eating through the roof, the sky above painted red. Samuel pulled Miriam back, just as the beams collapsed inward, sparks shooting into the night like stars. They stood side by side in the dirt, their chests heaving, the smell of charred wood thick around them. The herd pressed against the fence, restless but alive, the horses stamping but unhurt. They had saved what mattered, though the barn was nothing but blackened ruin. Samuel turned, his eyes falling on Miriam, her face smudged with soot, her hands raw from the bucket's rope, her body trembling yet still upright. In that moment, he did not see the woman the matchmaker had tricked him with, nor the figure townsfolk mocked as his burden. He saw the one who had fought beside him, who had carried water through smoke, who had not faltered when danger pressed close. She met his gaze, steady and unflinching, and he felt something shift deep inside, heavy and certain. He had thought her a mistake, an unwanted weight, but as the fire smoldered and the first pale streaks of dawn touched the horizon, Samuel knew the truth. She was the woman who had stood shoulder to shoulder with him when it counted, and that meant more than any promise of youth or beauty ever could. The smoke hung low in the morning air, drifting across the yard in pale ribbons as the sun pushed its way over the horizon. The barn stood in ruins, its timbers blackened, the roof caved in, the ground littered with ashes that still glowed faintly in the dawn. Samuel stood with his hands on his hips, his body aching from the long night, his eyes fixed on the damage. Miriam came beside him, her shoulders weary, her face streaked with soot, but her back straight and her gaze steady. Around them, the cattle shifted restlessly in the corral, alive and safe. The horses pawed at the ground but unhurt, and the dogs paced the edge of the yard, growling at shadows that were no longer there. For a long while neither spoke. The only sounds were the creak of the fence rails and the soft hiss of embers dying in the ruins. Samuel's chest felt heavy, not from the loss of wood and nails but from the truth that pressed against him. He had thought his life was measured by what he could build and guard, but last night had shown him something else. Something he could not name until he turned and saw Miriam standing firm in the light. She had carried water until her arms shook. She had fought smoke and fire with a will stronger than any man he had known, and she had not once asked to be shielded. He cleared his throat, the words slow, his voice rough. When I wrote for a wife, I thought I was asking for a girl, someone young, someone to build a family with. Someone who'd look at me without seeing all I'd lost. I thought youth meant a future. His eyes stayed on the ground, his hand clenching and unclenching as he spoke. Then he lifted his gaze to her and added quietly, "But what I got was a woman who showed me that living isn't just building, it's standing and fighting. It's finding someone who doesn't leave when the world turns hard. You've taught me more about what it means to live than I ever learned in all my years alone." Miriam's lips parted slightly, her breath catching. She looked down at her soot-stained hands, then back at him, her eyes shining, though her face held steady. "I thought I was too old to be wanted," she said softly, her voice carrying no self-pity, only truth, worn thin from years of being overlooked. "I thought I was being sent here because there was nothing left for me anywhere else. But last night I understood. I was not sent as a burden. I was sent because you needed me and I needed you. Not for what we used to be, but for what we are now." Samuel reached for her hand, his rough fingers curling around hers, and for the first time since they had met, she did not hesitate. They stood in the yard as the sun rose higher, the charred barn behind them, the sound of life stirring all around. Together they turned toward the house, not bride and rancher, not mistake and shame, but partners who had chosen each other when no one else would. As they walked back across the dust and ash, hand in hand, Samuel felt the silence he had always lived with finally break, replaced by something solid, something warm, something like peace. If this story left its mark on you, subscribe, like, and saddle up for more videos.